and welcome again to the Explaining History podcast. And today I'm going to be focusing on the issue of forced labour in Nazi Germany. Now, if you follow the podcast regularly, you will probably note over the last year we've been focusing heavily on exploring the Nazi camp system. One of the reasons for that is that in the past I've had a lot to say about the Soviet camps and less to say about those of Nazi Germany. And also, there's been a great deal generally said about the wartime death camps, and less is understood about the network of Nazi camps during the pre-war years, when they are concentration as opposed to death camps, which may seem like semantics, but there is an important difference between the two. One key similarity that's emerging from Nicholas Vashman's work in his amazing book KL, which if you haven't got it, do get it, it's an astounding piece of scholarship, are the economic imperatives behind the camps. Just as with the Soviet camps, the Nazi camps emerge in a slightly chaotic, uncertain manner. Their exact purpose isn't exactly clear, other than it's a place to lock away troublesome individuals and commence the social transformation of Germany, the removal of that kind of social ballast that Hitler's constantly talking about, that he viewed as being in part responsible for the loss of the First World War. But also the camps are a place of transformation through work, the reforging of souls, the recreation of good Aryan citizens through the strictures of hard work. The thing that happens with both the Nazi and the Soviet camps are obviously a kind of a trailblazer in this regard, being established long before the Nazi regime even emerges, is that they both become key drivers of the Nazi and Soviet economies. Why? Because these are centres where slave labour can be employed, where surplus labour value can be extracted from the workforce, and that industrialisation, in the case of the Soviet Union, and raw material mineral extraction, in the case of both regimes, can take place. And more, the Nazi camps and the Soviet camps are seen as kind of, as we would understand it, kind of the crude term of profit centres, of centres of capital accumulation. Nicholas Vashman writes, "When an esteemed German encyclopedia described the Nazi concentration camps, a new entry within its pages in 1937, it explained that prisoners were formed into groups and made to perform useful work. It was almost inevitable that the dictionary would highlight forced labour, since labour featured in almost all official Nazi accounts of the KL. No article or speech seemed complete without it, and although these references were all about propaganda, they pointed to a larger truth, that work dominated daily KL life, and that the thoughts of the prisoners, as this extract from the Sachsenhausen song illustrates." And the song goes, "Behind barbed wire is our work, our backs are sore from bending. We're turning hard, we're turning tough, our work is never ending." Now, Vashman points out that the forced labour was not a Nazi invention. One only needs to look back to the Victorian workhouse and the very mainstream legalistic conceptions of forced labour that had existed since the beginnings of mass society, and the means of imprisonment that went with that. Labour had various functions within the camps, a useful organising principle to keep inmates occupied, even if the labour is essentially fairly meaningless. Productive labour was said to drive down the costs of detention, so the camp becomes a profit centre and is able to finance itself through selling labour to local businesses or from extracting resources at rock bottom costs because there are no wages to pay. Productive labour had, or supposedly had, some kind of transformative or redemptive quality, that it was meant to be preparing social deviants for some sort of life where they could be productive citizens. Others claimed that it was an instrument for sadism, for that work was a kind of torture, and that if one had enough forced labour inflicted, one wouldn't commit the kinds of social crimes that winded one up in the camp in the first place. Now, previously, when we looked at the camp system, we saw how Himmler very quickly began to see it in economic terms. But let us not ignore the deliberate sadism that went with the use of forced labour, the idea that forced labour was there to humiliate and harm, along with other ideological and economic imperatives. Labour came to define the camp system by the mid 1930s. It wasn't one of the wasn't one of the original principles of the camp system. The labour in early camps had played a much smaller role. The speed with which the camps were set up meant that some officials just simply disregarded it. The creation of camps was done at a breakneck speed. There were some that manifested really just warehouses with barbed wire positioned around them initially. So it was, as we know, a very chaotic initial period of incarceration where forced labour programs don't really feature as a kind of an integral part of it. The early years of the camp seems to be kind of punctuated by a degree of uncertainty by camp administrators as to where forced labour should be used, and the point of forced labour. There had been a tradition in Germany long before the Nazification of the German penal system that political offenders were treated as a slightly rarefied, a slightly more special class of prisoner. Hitler had seen himself as a political prisoner. He had committed a state crime of treason and insurrection, but he viewed himself to be a political dissident, and he had not been subjected to forced labour in that regard. The position of prisoners in 1933, of some being entirely without work, wasn't unusual. Some of the guards in the early camps, in order to occupy prisoners, would force them to do military drill. Others would simply leave prisoners to do nothing in their cells and in their barracks and dormitories. Inmates who are first compelled to work in 1933 had two main types of labour to do. There was work outside, which meant that the camp became more visible as prisoners were marched out of the camp gates and to local sites where they performed manual work in prison uniform. Actions like moor drainage at Emsland, which was particularly arduous and backbreaking work, and other sort of major forestry clearance and agricultural work that was designed to cultivate the landscape and be productive to society. Building canals, building paths and roads, and bringing in harvests. In Breslau, for example, prisoners were forced to drain a muddy pond so that locals could use it as a swimming pool. Then there was the other kind of prison labour of camp construction. So the prisoners were occupied within the camp itself, and general maintenance, putting up or repairing different buildings, installing barbed wire that surrounded them. So the prisoners were building the infrastructure of their own imprisonment. Other prisoners had to provide services such as cleaning rooms and corridors, preparing food or distributing it. This kind of captive labour theoretically served a useful purpose, but in reality it became a tool for the sadistic camp guards to terrorise the prisoners they disliked the most, to distribute beatings and acts of violence, and excruciating acts of physical hardship, as a kind of a way of circumventing the remaining rules that had been imposed by the German courts on the camps to prevent excesses of violence against prisoners. If you remember, you may have listened to it last year, I think. I did a podcast which spelled out initially some of the limitations that the SA and SS were under in the camp system that prevented them from acting out too violently. Well, there were all sorts of loopholes around this. Inmates were most likely to endure pointless labour. In a Heuberg camp, for example, prominent political prisoners had to fill baskets with pebbles only to tip them all out and start all over again. So in the mid-1930s, the camp system is coordinated. The various practices in different camps are standardised, and Theodor Eicke, as the commandant of the camp system, the entire camp system, managed to ensure that uniformity was enforced across the camp network. The SS were now ordered to have no tolerance for any kind of idleness, and work was constant and compulsory for all inmates. Theodor Eicke's regulations for Esterwagen camp put it: anyone refusing to work, evading work, or for the purpose of doing nothing, feigning physical weakness or sickness, is regarded as incorrigible and is made to answer for himself. And this could result in all manner of serious consequences. At the same time, during the period of coordination, outside use of labour, so camp inmates being sent to forest clearance sites or canal building or whatever, out of the camp, that stops, and most of the labour is concentrated within the camp. This was really about starting to end the relationship between the camp system and the public, preventing the general public from knowing what was going on in the camps. So as prisoners were forced to build the camps themselves, the main economic beneficiary of the camp system was the camp system. Unlike during the war, when Jews were shipped out of the Warsaw Ghetto or the Krakow Ghetto to work in the factories of Nazi backing business figures, the Oskar Schindlers of the world, and the SS sold labour to war profiteers. At this stage, prisoners forced to work within the camps were being forced to give free labour, and therefore the improved infrastructure of the camps come with no labour costs attached. Nicholas Wachsman writes, all 5 concentration camps set up between 1936 and 1939, starting with Sachsenhausen, were built on the backs of prisoners, and the first weeks and months in a new camp always ranked among the worst. Afterwards, the Buchenwald survivor Eugen Kogan wrote, misery at least consolidated itself. In summer and autumn 1937, the first Buchenwald prisoners had to fell trees, erect barracks, dig trenches, and carry stones and tree trunks, struggling for 12 hours a day or more as the camp slowly grew. Illness and injuries were frequent, and the prisoners who could not keep up, like the frail Hans Litten, faced slaps, kicks, and worse. What was more, the prisoners had to endure the primitive conditions typical of new camps. In the beginning there were no beds, blankets, or running water in Buchenwald. Mud was everywhere, clinging to the prisoners' shoes, uniforms, and faces. These conditions, combined with SS terror and exhausting labour, had fatal consequences. Between August and December 1937, 53 prisoners died in the new camp at Buchenwald. Over the same period, 14 prisoners died in Sachsenhausen, which was already up and running. Of course, heavy construction work did not cease after the foundations had been laid. None of the large camps were ever finished, and the SS continued to exploit prisoners for repairs and extensions. During the pre-war years, around 90% of all Buchenwald prisoners worked on the camp itself. Some of the approaches to businesses outside the camp system are piecemeal and patchwork. Unlike the Stalinist 5-year plans, where there was a centrally directed program for economic development, of which the gulags formed an integral part, the Nazi camps don't seem to have had quite the same direction, quite the same purpose. There was little evidence that Himmler had a long-term economic strategy for the use of camp labour that would see large-scale manufacturing or mining or anything like that. But then, in fairness, the Soviet camp population by the mid-1930s is vastly, vastly higher than the Nazi camp population by at least a factor of 10. So the workforce that Stalin had available to him was infinitely greater. So instead of centrally directed labour towards big economic goals, the Nazi camps allowed the deployment of labour in sort of small-scale enterprises. One particular example was a porcelain factory, turning out small and tasteless little kind of trinkets and ornamental plates and things like that. Hardly the sort of the stuff of the mines of Kolyma and the forced industrialization of Stalinism. Camp commandants had most decision-making and most initiative when it came to deploying labour, and they tended to delegate this role down to guard level. And guards were generally not interested in macroeconomics and more interested in sadism and violence. For example, one of the prisoners, Harry Neuerk, remembered in 1936 when an SS officer had forced him and other Sachsenhausen prisoners to stop flattening some cleared out woodland and to dig deep holes instead at an ever increasing pace. For no reason other than to exhaust and to cause added stress and suffering. Harry Neuerk wrote, "We are only robots now." Driven by violence, kicks and punches, the prisoners shovelled manically until the area they had just levelled resembled a moonscape. Our earlier work is being destroyed, completely pointlessly, he added. The SS economic ambitions for the KL then don't quite ever really blossom into something more profitable. They do benefit the camp construction itself. They do result in the camp system benefiting from free labour. However, the mass deployment of labour and the mass exploitation of labour for profit doesn't really happen in the Nazi system until during the war and the use of mass Jewish labour. But one area that does produce revenues for the regime are the prisoner workshops at Dachau. They were not only the earliest of the economic ventures, but one of the more significant ones. In 1933, the Camp SS set up workshops to cater for the needs of the new camp. Even though some protests from local business emerged about SS competition, the complex started to quickly grow over the coming years and started to supply SS troops. So the main beneficiary, once again, is the SS itself getting free labour and one camp, an internal market seeming to emerge within the SS of camps selling the products of free labour to other SS units. SS troops were supplied. By 1939, 370 prisoners were working in a big carpentry workshop in Dachau, producing bed frames, tables, and chairs for general SS use, presumably for SS barracks and that sort of thing. Despite the fact that general terror and sadism still seemed to be the operant feature of the camp, it did demonstrate that the workshop system could be used to provide profitable SS businesses, all based obviously on forced coerced labour. It also demonstrated that prisoners could be exploited without compromising the overall mission of the KL, which was firstly to remove politically dangerous people from society and socially dangerous people from society, but also to somehow mystically transform them into good Aryan Germans through the means of forced labour. SS leaders began to see that production and terror were compatible with one another, and this made more aggressive economic policies in the later 30s start to emerge. Okay, so there we'll leave it in just a moment, and there are some interesting synergies between the two camp systems in Germany and the Soviet Union, and also some fundamental differences too. But the overall, the use of forced labour as a means of kind of discipline, correction, transformation, and economic exploitation all exist in both camp systems in different quantities and with slightly different focuses. Okay, so well, thanks for listening, and if you can possibly check out our Patreon page, where, as I've probably mentioned before, reliant on the generosity of our patrons and also on a tiny trickle of ad revenue that we get with the Explaining History podcast. So any contribution is gratefully accepted. Thanks so much for listening, and I'll catch you on the very next Explaining History podcast. All the best. Thank you. Bye-bye.